They told us the Apollo missions were all about science, exploration, and planting a flag on the moon. But here's the truth. There are stories NASA never wanted in the spotlight. And tonight, you're going to hear them. Subscribe now so you don't miss the mysteries waiting in the dark. We've all seen the same images over and over again, astronauts bouncing on the lunar surface, the American flag stiff and silent, the famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." But what about the moments the cameras didn't catch? The things whispered only in private, written in mission logs, that almost never saw the light of day? In this video, you're going to hear the side of the Apollo missions you weren't taught in school. The strange, the quiet, and the almost forgotten. Not conspiracy theories, not tall tales, but rare, little-known stories from inside NASA ones that still raise questions today. Picture this for a moment. It's the late 1962. The world is buzzing about space. Every newspaper headline is about rockets and astronauts. But behind closed doors, inside the control rooms, strange incidents were happening. Some too mysterious to explain, some so unsettling that the astronauts themselves barely spoke of them again. And that's where we begin. Let's start with Apollo 11, the mission everyone knows, the moment humanity first touched another world. But what people forget is that during those crucial first minutes on the moon, radio silence fell. NASA's public transmission cut out for almost 2 minutes. What was said in that gap? Some believe Armstrong and Aldrin reported something unusual. According to a few unconfirmed reports, later whispered among amateur radio operators, they described large objects watching them from the edge of a crater. Now, officially, NASA denied anything strange happened. But that silence, that gap in history, it still lingers like an unsolved riddle. Now, take a deep breath. Imagine being inside that cramped lunar module. You're sitting in a suit that feels like a coffin, staring out at an alien world with no air, no sound, no life. The Earth is a tiny marble in the sky, and you know millions are listening back home. But suddenly, you think you see something. Do you speak up? Do you keep quiet? That tension, that possibility, is one of the most fascinating mysteries of Apollo 11. But Apollo 11 wasn't the only mission with stories buried beneath the headlines. Apollo 12, often forgotten, almost didn't make it at all. Just seconds after liftoff, lightning struck the rocket twice. The entire spacecraft went dark. Instruments went dead. And for a brief, terrifying moment, it looked like the mission was over before it had even started. Imagine the panic in mission control. Millions watching live on television. Astronauts strapped to a giant bomb of fuel with all systems failing. And then a single voice saved the mission. A young flight controller named John Aaron remembered a rare test procedure from months earlier. He shouted into his headset, "Try SCE to AUX." The command made no sense to most in the room. Even the astronauts didn't know what it meant. But they flipped the switch, and suddenly the lights came back on. Systems rebooted. Apollo 12 was alive again. a 1 in a million save. Without that single command, the mission and maybe the crew would have been lost, rarely talked about. But that's how close history came to disaster. Now, think about it. The moon landings we see as flawless, almost mythical achievements were balanced on moments like these tiny margins, split-second decisions, strokes of luck. It makes you wonder how much of history depends on things we never hear about. And speaking of things we don't hear about Apollo 13, everyone knows the famous line, "Houston, we've had a problem." The explosion that crippled the spacecraft is legendary. But what's less known is how close that mission came to becoming a silent grave drifting forever in space. The astronauts were freezing, their oxygen dwindling, their power almost gone. They improvised a carbon dioxide filter with duct tape and cardboard, essentially building their own survival tool out of scraps. And through it all, the odds of getting home were so slim that President Nixon actually had a speech written in advance in case the crew never made it back. That speech still exists in the archives. It begins with the chilling words, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." Imagine being those astronauts, cold, tired, staring into the void while knowing the world was already preparing for your funeral. But here's the haunting twist. While Apollo 13 never landed on the moon, some in NASA later admitted the explosion may have saved their lives. Because if it hadn't happened when it did, the oxygen tank might have ruptured after they landed, stranding them on the lunar surface with no way back. So what looked like a disaster may have been, in a strange way, a form of luck, a cosmic warning. Already, you can see that the Apollo story is so much more than a clean victory march. It's fragile, it's messy, it's filled with near misses, close calls, and unanswered questions. And these are only the beginning. Because as the missions went on, astronauts started reporting stranger things, mysteries, not always written into the official history books. They told us the Apollo missions were all about science, exploration, and planting a flag on the moon. But here's the truth. There are stories NASA never wanted in the spotlight. And tonight, you're going to hear them. Subscribe now so you don't miss the mysteries waiting in the dark. We've all seen the same images over and over again, astronauts bouncing on the lunar surface, the American flag stiff and silent, the famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." But what about the moments the cameras didn't catch? The things whispered only in private, written in mission logs that almost never saw the light of day? In this video, you are going to hear the side of the Apollo missions you weren't taught in school. The strange, the quiet, and the almost forgotten. Not conspiracy theories, not tall tales, but rare, little-known stories from inside NASA ones that still raise questions today. Picture this for a moment. It's the late 1962. The world is buzzing about space. Every newspaper headline is about rockets and astronauts. But behind closed doors, inside the control rooms, strange incidents were happening. Some too mysterious to explain, some so unsettling that the astronauts themselves barely spoke of them again. And that's where we begin. Let's start with Apollo 11, the mission everyone knows. The moment humanity first touched another world. But what people forget is that during those crucial first minutes on the moon, radio silence fell. NASA's public transmission cut out for almost 2 minutes. What was said in that gap? Some believe Armstrong and Aldrin reported something unusual. According to a few unconfirmed reports later whispered among amateur radio operators, they described large objects watching them from the edge of a crater. Now, officially, NASA denied anything strange happened. But that silence, that gap in history, it still lingers like an unsolved riddle. Now, take a deep breath. Imagine being inside that cramped lunar module. You're sitting in a suit that feels like a coffin, staring out at an alien world with no air, no sound, no life. The Earth is a tiny marble in the sky, and you know millions are listening back home. But suddenly, you think you see something. Do you speak up? Do you keep quiet? That tension, that possibility, is one of the most fascinating mysteries of Apollo 11. But Apollo 11 wasn't the only mission with stories buried beneath the headlines. Apollo 12, often forgotten, almost didn't make it at all. Just seconds after liftoff, lightning struck the rocket twice. The entire spacecraft went dark, instruments went dead, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it looked like the mission was over before it had even started. Imagine the panic in mission control. Millions watching live on television. Astronauts strapped to a giant bomb of fuel, with all systems failing. And then a single voice saved the mission. A young flight controller named John Aaron remembered a rare test procedure from months earlier. He shouted into his headset, "Try SCE-2 The command made no sense to most in the room. Even the astronauts didn't know what it meant. But they flipped the switch, and suddenly the lights came back on. Systems rebooted. Apollo 12 was alive again. A 1 in a million save. Without that single command, the mission and maybe the crew would have been lost, rarely talked about. But that's how close history came to disaster. Now, think about it. The moon landings we see as flawless, almost mythical achievements were balanced on moments like this: tiny margins, split-second decisions, strokes of luck. It makes you wonder how much of history depends on things we never hear about. And speaking of things we don't hear about Apollo 13, everyone knows the famous line, "Houston, we've had a problem." The explosion that crippled the spacecraft is legendary. But what's less known is how close that mission came to becoming a silent grave drifting forever in space. The astronauts were freezing, their oxygen dwindling, their power almost gone. They improvised a carbon dioxide filter with duct tape and cardboard, essentially building their own survival tool out of scraps. And through it all, the odds of getting home were so slim that President Nixon actually had a speech written in advance in case the crew never made it back. That speech still exists in the archives. It begins with the chilling words, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. Imagine being those astronauts, cold, tired, staring into the void while knowing the world was already preparing for your funeral. But here's the haunting twist. While Apollo 13 never landed on the moon, some in NASA later admitted the explosion may have saved their lives. Because if it hadn't happened when it did, the oxygen tank might have ruptured after they landed, stranding them on the lunar surface with no way back. So what looked like a disaster may have been, in a strange way, a form of luck, a cosmic warning. Already, you can see that the Apollo story is so much more than a clean victory march. It's fragile, it's messy, it's filled with near misses, close calls, and unanswered questions. And these are only the beginning. Because as the missions went on, astronauts started reporting Stranger Things mysteries, not always written into the official history books. They thought Apollo 11 was the end of the story. The flag planted, the steps taken, the words carved into history. But that wasn't the end at all. It was only the beginning of stories that most people never heard. The later missions, the ones not written in bold headlines, carried some of the strangest, most human, and most fragile moments of exploration. Take Apollo 12, for instance. Only a few months after Neil and Buzz returned home, a new crew prepared to follow in their footsteps. Their rocket rose into stormy skies, thunder rumbling in the distance. Just seconds after liftoff, lightning struck, not once, but twice. In the tiny cabin, the astronauts watched in shock as their control panels went dark. Warning lights flashed, instruments died. For a heartbeat, the world fell silent. Imagine sitting atop a skyscraper-sized rocket full of explosive fuel and suddenly all your systems fail. Down in mission control, panic spread like wildfire. Alarms screamed across the consoles, engineers yelling over one another. And then amid the chaos, a young flight controller remembered a line from training manuals, a forgotten switch most never thought about. He calmly radioed 3 words, "Try SCE to aux." The astronauts flipped the switch, power surged back, and just like that, the mission was saved. It's a moment that shows how exploration isn't always about grand speeches or giant leaps. Sometimes, history turns on the memory of a single engineer in a room full of noise. When Apollo 12 finally reached the moon, Pete Conrad, the commander, decided to make his first words light-hearted. He was shorter than Neil Armstrong, and as he hopped onto the surface, he laughed. Whoopee! Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me. His words remind us that the moon wasn't just a stage for heroes. It was a place where humor, personality, and humanity found space too. Then came Apollo 13, the mission that almost ended it all. The words are famous. Houston, we've had a problem. But what's less remembered is what it felt like inside that crippled ship. The temperature dropped so low, their breath fogged in the air, their fingers grew stiff from the cold. They rationed water to mere sips, sometimes going without. The carbon dioxide levels crept higher, threatening to suffocate them. And yet through the fear they cracked jokes, scribbled down thoughts, whispered quiet prayers. One of them later admitted he thought they wouldn't live to see Earth again. But when he peered through the window and saw the glowing blue marble far away, floating alone in endless black, the fear eased. Somehow, the sight of Earth, small, fragile, glowing, was enough to keep him steady. That view reminded them why they had to survive. By Apollo 14, NASA regained its confidence. Alan Shepard, a seasoned astronaut, carried a secret. Hidden away in his gear was the head of a 6-iron golf club. On the moon, in low gravity, he attached it to a tool handle, set a ball on the dust, and swung. The first shot dribbled a few feet. The second soared, arcing across the lifeless horizon. It was clumsy, funny, imperfect, but it was pure humanity. Even on a dead world, we find ways to play. Apollo 15 pushed exploration further. For the first time, they brought the lunar rover a car for the moon. Imagine it. Astronauts bouncing over alien hills, wheels kicking up dust in slow motion, their laughter echoing in their headsets. They covered miles of terrain no human had ever seen, exploring valleys, craters, and mountains. They planted science stations that still sit there today, silent guardians of lunar secrets. In those moments, the moon stopped feeling like a faraway rock and started to feel like a place wild, strange, but touchable. But not all was playful. Apollo 16 faced a near disaster in lunar orbit. Their command module, the only lifeboat home, began to act unpredictably. For a few terrifying minutes, it seemed the ship might spiral out of control. Think of it. 3 humans circling the moon, staring down at the grey surface below, knowing that if their craft failed, there would be no rescue, no second chance, just endless silence. But through calm voices and steady hands, they wrestled the ship back under control. They carried on, because turning back wasn't an option. And then Apollo 17, the final mission. Eugene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, carried with him something deeply personal. On the lunar surface, he knelt down and traced his daughter's initials in the dust. A father's love carved into a world without wind or rain. Those initials will last for millions of years. Long after our cities crumble, long after our voices fade, the moon will hold them. When it was time to leave, Cernan paused, looked at the alien landscape one last time, and said words that few remember. We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Then he turned, walked back to the lunar module, and closed the chapter on Apollo. And then, silence. No more missions. No more footsteps. Humanity touched another world 6 times, and then stopped. No grand farewell. No permanent base. Just astronauts returning home, shaking hands, giving quiet interviews, and moving on. And that silence has lasted for 50 years. The world remembers Apollo 11, but Apollo 12 through 17. Their stories faded, tucked into dusty archives. Yet in those forgotten missions, lie the soul of Apollo, the close calls, the laughter, the improvisation, the tiny human moments that made it real, the golf ball that flew into the unknown, the initials in the dust, the engineers saving a mission with a 3-word command. These are the rare stories, the ones that slipped through the cracks, the ones that remind us exploration is not just about glory, it's about fragility, fear, humor, and hope. And it makes us ask, why did it stop? Why, after reaching so far, after touching another world with our own hands, did we turn back and stay here, watching from below? After Apollo 17, the world expected more. People imagined moon bases, cities in space, even footsteps on Mars by the year 2000. Science fiction had planted those dreams in every mind. But instead, nothing. No more rockets rose toward the moon. The greatest adventure of humanity ended almost as suddenly as it began. And the question is, why? The truth is more complicated than most realize. It wasn't failure. It wasn't technology. It wasn't even danger. The challenge that ended Apollo was us. Back in the 1962nd, Apollo was fueled by something bigger than curiosity. It was the space race. The United States and the Soviet Union, locked in Cold War tension, both desperate to prove superiority not just with weapons, but with science, with daring, with vision. The moon became the ultimate prize. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, America had won. The race was over. The flag was planted. The goal achieved. And with the finish line crossed, the urgency drained away. Suddenly, politicians asked a harder question. Why keep spending billions on the project already won? The costs were staggering. At its peak, NASA consumed more than 4% of the federal budget. Imagine that today, it's less than half of 1%. To some, Apollo was worth every penny. To others, it was a luxury in a world filled with war, poverty, and unrest. The Vietnam War raged on. Civil rights struggles filled the streets. People asked why we were reaching for the moon while problems on Earth burned unsolved. And there were tragedies too. Apollo 1 had already shown how deadly spaceflight could be. A cabin fire during a test claimed the lives of 3 astronauts before the program had even begun. Later, Apollo 13 nearly became a tomb in space. Those moments reminded everyone space was not just inspiring, it was dangerous, terrifyingly so. By the early 1972nd, NASA had already built the hardware for 3 more lunar missions, Apollo 18, 19, and 20. The rockets existed. The spacecraft were ready. Astronauts were training. Entire missions mapped out and waiting. But one by one, they were cancelled. Their equipment was sent to museums. Their astronauts reassigned. Plans for moon bases were shelved. Dreams of Mars landings pushed into the vague future. For the astronauts themselves, it was heartbreaking. They had tasted adventure beyond imagination. Some had walked across alien valleys, driven rovers across landscapes no one had seen before, gazed at Earth as a glowing jewel rising over lunar mountains. To be told that's it, that there would be no return, was like being asked to step back into ordinary life after glimpsing eternity. Eugene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, once said, "We went to explore the moon and in fact discovered the Earth." And yet, even as he said those words, he knew humanity was turning away from exploration. The problem wasn't courage, it wasn't ability, it was will. Exploration costs money. Exploration demands sacrifice. And once the political prize was won, the will began to fade. Think about it. In 1969, over 600 million people watched Apollo 11 live on television. By Apollo 17, just 3 years later, viewership had plummeted. People flipped the channel. Moonwalks that should have captured imagination became background noise. The extraordinary had become ordinary. That's the challenge. Humanity's attention is fragile. We crave novelty. We thrill at the first step, the first leap, the first miracle. But the second, the third, the sixth, familiarity dulls the wonder. The moon, once mysterious and untouchable, became another place on the map. And people, distracted by the chaos of life on Earth, stopped looking up. So, Apollo ended. Not with disaster, not with defeat, but with silence. And silence can be louder than explosions. Because now, 50 years later, we still ask, why did we stop? Why, after proving we could touch another world, did we stay home? It is a question without a simple answer. Some say it was politics. Some say it was money. Some whisper darker reasons, mysteries hidden on the moon that NASA never spoke of, secrets locked away. But whatever the reason, one truth remains. Apollo showed us what we are capable of. And then we walked away. Silence is a strange thing. After the roar of Saturn V rockets, after the cheers of the world, the sudden absence of Apollo missions left a kind of hollow space in history. And in that silence, questions began to grow. People began asking, what about the missions that never happened? See, when Apollo ended, not every mission was simply erased. Some plans existed, hidden in technical papers, in drawings, in schedules. These became known as the cancelled Apollos. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were more than just names. They had crews assigned, flight paths plotted, even rockets built. But they never left Earth. And when something is built to go to the moon, but never goes, well, imaginations start to wander. Some say the cancellations were strictly budget cuts. Others believe there was more to the story, that NASA had seen something or discovered something on the moon that made continuing impossible. Let's slow down and look at each one. Apollo 18, according to records, was meant to land in a region known as Copernicus Crater, a dramatic, sprawling impact site with walls taller than mountains on Earth. Imagine astronauts climbing those ridges, standing on the edge of a cosmic scar. But the mission was scrubbed. The crew who trained for it, people who had dreamed of leaving their footprints there, never got the chance. Apollo 19 would have traveled further south, near the region called Hyginus reel, a long, deep groove cut across the moon's surface like a scar left by some unimaginable hand. Geologists wanted to know, was it formed by collapse or by lava tunnels from an ancient volcanic moon? We never got the answer. And Apollo 20, the most mysterious of all, was once planned as a joint mission between NASA and the Air Force, aiming for the lunar highlands. Some rumors even whisper it had another destination entirely, not science, but secrecy. Now here's where things take a turn. In the decades since, stories began to surface. People claimed Apollo 18 was not cancelled at all, that it secretly launched, that its crew went to the far side of the moon where no Earth-based radio could reach them. And what they found there, if the stories are true, was not just rock and dust. Some conspiracy theories say astronauts stumbled upon evidence of something artificial, structures, debris, even a crashed spacecraft not of human design. Photographs began to appear online in the early 2000s, second, grainy, shadowy, supposedly leaked from hidden archives. One even showed what looked like a massive cigar-shaped object resting inside a crater. Skeptics dismiss it all as fakes, but still the whispers spread. The most infamous of these was the so-called Apollo 20 footage. According to legend, Apollo 20 launched in 1976 as a top-secret mission. Its purpose? To investigate an ancient spacecraft supposedly lying on the lunar surface. The leaked footage, if you've ever seen it, shows eerie images. Astronauts walking through the wreckage. A body inside, humanoid but not human. Some call her the Mona Lisa of the moon. Of course, mainstream science rejects these stories. NASA maintains that Apollo 20 never existed, that all footage is fabricated. But the mystery lingers. Why do so many feel there's more to the Apollo story than what we were told? Why do we keep returning to the moon in our dreams, even when our rockets do not? Part of it might be human nature. We're storytellers. When we see an unfinished chapter, we want to imagine how it ends. And Apollo left behind many unfinished chapters. But then again, consider this. Every Apollo crew reported strange experiences on the moon, lights flashing on the horizon where no atmosphere exists, glowing particles dancing outside their windows, radio interference that garbled their voices. At the time, these were brushed off as space phenomena. But late at night, reading through the logs, you can't help but wonder, was it really just phenomena? Or was something watching? Michael Collins, orbiting alone around the moon during Apollo 11, once admitted that he felt like he wasn't alone, as if something out there was aware of him, circling in the dark. Buzz Aldrin has spoken openly about seeing unidentified objects in space. To this day, his words are debated, analyzed, replayed. Was it just part of the spacecraft, or something more? The moon is not a dead world, it's a mirror. It reflects not just sunlight, but our deepest fears and questions. When the astronauts looked down at it, when they walked across its silent plains, they carried more than equipment. They carried human imagination. And imagination can be heavier than gravity. The rare NASA stories you never heard aren't always written in secret documents. They're hidden between the lines of official transcripts, in the pauses of an astronaut's voice, in the way history turns away from one detail and lingers on another. So perhaps the real mystery isn't whether Apollo 18 or 20 happened. Perhaps it's why so many of us feel like we've been told only part of the story. The moon is still up there, waiting, watching, silent. And silence, as we've learned, always leaves room for questions. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine being in space, drifting in silence, you probably picture peace, a vast stillness, nothing but stars. But for the men of Apollo, that silence wasn't always so quiet. There's one story that still stirs questions today, the so-called space music. In 1969, Apollo 10 entered lunar orbit. Its mission was a dress rehearsal for Apollo 11, everything except the actual landing. The astronauts, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan, were professionals, calm and steady men. Yet when they reached the far side of the moon, cut off from radio contact with Earth, they heard something strange. A wooing sound, a kind of eerie outer space melody that filled their headsets. It wasn't static, it wasn't interference. The astronauts describe it as spacey music. For decades, the tapes of that conversation were classified. When they finally became public, people wondered, what exactly were they hearing? NASA suggested it was radio interference between their lunar and command modules. Logical, perhaps. But the astronauts themselves didn't seem convinced. And out there, orbiting the dark side of the moon with Earth hidden from view, the sound must have felt more than technical. It must have felt almost alive. That wasn't the only oddity. Apollo 11, the first moon landing, carried its own mysteries. Buzz Aldrin has spoken about seeing unidentified objects outside their spacecraft, glowing, moving alongside them. He reported it to Mission Control, carefully choosing his words. Later, NASA explained it away as part of the Saturn V rocket drifting nearby. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Michael Collins, orbiting alone in the command module while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the moon, described an eerie loneliness. He wrote later that he felt watched, as if unseeing eyes were studying him from the void. Imagine that. You are the only human in existence cut off from both Earth and your crew, on the far side of the moon, where no signal reaches, alone, except for a presence you can't name. Apollo 12 brought its own strangeness. Just seconds after liftoff, lightning struck the rocket. Twice. The spacecraft's systems went dark. Alarms blared. For a moment, the entire mission was on the edge of disaster. Later, once safely in orbit, the crew joked about it. But think about it. Lightning, out of nowhere, on the precise path of one of the most complex machines ever built. Coincidence or something more? And then Apollo 15. As Commander David Scott and lunar module pilot James Irwin explored the Hadley Rill, they found something unusual. A rock. Not just any rock, but one they nicknamed the Genesis Rock. White, crystalline, ancient. Scientists believe it may be over 4 billion years old, a fragment of the moon's primordial crust. Holding it in their hands, they weren't just looking at geology, they were holding time itself. But even here, stories emerged. Some whispered that what they found was more than just stone, that it didn't belong in that place. Time and again, Apollo crews reported flashes of light in their vision, even with their eyes closed, even in total darkness. Some described them as streaks, others as bursts, like cosmic fireflies. Later studies suggested it was cosmic rays particles from deep space striking their retinas. But imagine living through it. You're trying to sleep inside a cramped capsule, the hum of machinery your only lullaby, and suddenly a flash of light burns across your mind like a ghost passing through your skull. Night after night. It must have felt less like signs and more like a haunting. And there were whispers the public didn't hear until years later. Conversations muted, transmissions cut. Apollo 11, for example, had a 2-minute blackout. Some believe Armstrong described seeing structures on the moon during that gap. Towers, domes, shapes not made by nature. NASA denies it. But denials don't erase curiosity. One of the strangest accounts comes not from the astronauts themselves, but from those who listened. Amateur radio operators, people with equipment strong enough to pick up stray transmissions, claimed they overheard parts of conversations never aired on television. Reports of moving lights on the lunar surface. Questions asked in voices tense with something more than excitement. Were they misunderstandings, interference, or accidental leaks of truths never meant to be heard? And yet, through it all, the astronauts remained steady. They did their jobs. They smiled on camera. They planted flags, drove rovers, collected rocks. Heroes. Yes, but also keepers of experiences they could never fully explain. Think about that the next time you see their famous photos. Behind every smile, behind every careful phrase, might have been a memory of something that didn't fit neatly into science, something that didn't belong. These are the stories that don't make it into school textbooks. They sit instead in the margins of history, in declassified documents, in rumors shared late at night. But they remind us of one thing. The Apollo missions weren't just about science. They were about mystery. And the moon, in all its silent beauty, has a way of keeping its mysteries close. The Apollo missions weren't just about flag planting and famous words. They were also about danger. Danger that, in many cases, the public never fully saw. Space is hostile, and every mission carried secrets of how close we came to disaster. One of the most striking examples is Apollo 12. Only 36 seconds after liftoff, lightning struck the Saturn V rocket. A blinding flash lit up the sky, and suddenly, almost every system inside the spacecraft went dead. Alarms screamed. Lights blinked out. For a moment, it seemed as if the mission would end in fire, with 3 astronauts lost before even leaving Earth's atmosphere. The solution came from one voice inside Mission Control, a young flight controller named John Aaron. He remembered an obscure switch called SCE to AUX, a command that most people didn't even recall. He told the crew to flip it. They did, and miraculously, the systems came back online. That obscure command saved the mission and perhaps saved lives. Without it, Apollo 12 would never have left Earth. It's one of those rare NASA stories that shows how thin the line is between triumph and tragedy. Apollo 14 carried its own drama. Commander Alan Shepard, known as the first American in space, was determined to walk on the moon. But as the lunar module descended toward the surface, alarms lit up. The landing radar refused to lock on. Without it, the computer couldn't calculate a safe descent. For a few tense minutes, Shepard and Edgar Mitchell faced the possibility of aborting the landing. At the last possible moment, the radar came online. Later, some suggested it was never hardware failure at all, but a software bug hidden deep in the system. Whatever the cause, Apollo 14 came within a heartbeat of being the first failed moon landing. Apollo 16 wasn't free from trouble either. In orbit around the moon, the crew discovered a problem with their command module's main engine. The concern was simple. If the engine didn't fire properly, they'd be stranded. No way home. For hours, NASA debated whether it was safe for John Young and Charles Duke to continue their moonwalk. The decision was agonizing: cut the mission short or risk everything. In the end, they went ahead. But the shadow of that engine fault lingered until they were safely back on Earth. And then, of course, Apollo 13. Everyone knows the phrase, "Houston, we've had a problem." But even now, many don't realize how close humanity came to losing that crew. An oxygen tank exploded, ripping apart their service module. Power vanished. Life support failed. Jim Lovell, Fred Heisey, and Jack Swigert were left adrift 200,000 miles from home, inside a freezing spacecraft with barely enough air to breathe. NASA had to improvise. The crew had to jury-rig carbon dioxide scrubbers with tape, cardboard, and plastic bags. They rationed water until their lips cracked and their throats burned. Their bodies chilled as the spacecraft dropped below freezing, frost forming on every surface. It wasn't just science, it was survival. What makes Apollo 13 even more haunting is how slim the margins were. A wrong burn angle, a miscalculated maneuver, a simple mistake, and the spacecraft would have missed Earth entirely, lost forever in the void. That they made it back alive wasn't just a triumph of engineering, it was a miracle of calm under pressure. But Apollo's rare stories weren't always about systems failing. Sometimes they were about the astronauts themselves. During Apollo 7, the first crewed mission after the Apollo 1 fire, the astronauts clashed with Mission Control. Wally Schirra, the commander, developed a bad code in space. With sinuses clogged and pressure in his head, he grew irritable. He refused certain orders. He snapped at controllers. In an age where astronauts were expected to be picture perfect, Apollo 7 revealed the human side, the frustration, the limits, the fact that even heroes catch codes. On Apollo 15, astronauts were accused of smuggling unauthorized postage stamps to the moon, planning to sell them later as collectibles. NASA was furious when it came to light. Careers were quietly ruined. It's a reminder that even in the midst of history, small human flaws, greed, pride, mistakes still found their way in. Then there were the health scares. The Apollo 15 crew returned home to find one astronaut, James Irwin, suffering heart irregularities, likely caused by the stress of moonwalking. Later, doctors would note that nearly every astronaut showed signs of physical strain, calcium loss from bones, muscle deterioration, even eye problems. Space wasn't just dangerous for machines. It was dangerous for the human body itself. And yet, through all of this, Apollo pushed forward. Every lightning strike, every glitching radar, every code and every hidden flaw in the system, the missions carried on. And because of that persistence, humanity made it to the moon 6 times. But those rare NASA stories, the ones not shown on television, tell us how razor-thin the margin really was. How often the missions nearly failed. How easily Apollo could have ended as tragedy rather than triumph. They remind us of a simple truth. Behind the photographs and speeches, behind the smiling astronauts in their bulky suits, were men and women wrestling with unknowns so vast they couldn't always be spoken aloud. And perhaps that's what makes Apollo's lesser-known tales so haunting. Not just the mysteries of what the astronauts saw, but the quiet dangers of what almost ended them. The Apollo missions were not only about rockets, engines, and precise calculations. They were about people, human beings, with fears, longings, and private struggles that didn't always make it into the official transcripts. Behind every bold photograph of a space-suited figure on the moon was a person who carried secrets of what it felt like to be so far from home. One of the rare stories from Apollo is how lonely space could truly feel. Astronaut Michael Collins, who stayed in orbit while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon during Apollo 11, once admitted he felt an isolation that no human had ever experienced. As the command module passed around the far side of the moon, Earth vanished completely from sight and radio contact cut off. For nearly an hour, he was alone, utterly alone, no voices, no signals, just the silent moon below and the endless black above. He later wrote that in those moments, he was the most alone human being in the history of the world. For some astronauts, the silence of space was not peaceful but haunting. Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13, said that during the crisis of their damaged spacecraft, there were moments of stillness where all he could hear was his own breathing inside his helmet. He described it like sitting in a vast cathedral, empty, cold, but sacred. For men who had flown combat missions and seen fire and chaos, it was the silence of space that lingered with him for the rest of his life. Others carried emotional burdens in different ways. Alan Bean of Apollo 12 struggled after returning home. He said that walking on the moon had been so overwhelming, so dreamlike, that nothing on Earth ever quite measured up afterward. He turned to painting, pouring moon dust colors onto canvas, because words never seemed enough to capture what he had seen. For him, the Apollo mission was not just a scientific journey, but a deeply personal transformation that he wrestled with until his last days. Then there was Charles Duke, the youngest man ever to walk on the moon at just 36 years old. He left a photograph of his family on the lunar surface, a simple picture sealed in plastic. It showed his wife and children smiling. He wanted, in some way, to bring them with him, to make the barren grey moon a little more human. The photograph still lies there, untouched for over 50 years, slowly fading under the harsh sunlight. To this day, it may be the loneliest family portrait in existence. Apollo 15's James Irwin had another deeply personal experience. While walking on the moon, he later confessed he felt a profound sense of God's presence. The stark alien landscape and the fragile beauty of Earth hanging in the black sky struck him with awe. When he returned home, he dedicated the rest of his life to spiritual pursuits, saying the moon had changed him forever. For him, spaceflight was not only a technical achievement, it was a spiritual awakening. But space wasn't only about grand emotions. Sometimes it was about small, quiet human details. During Apollo 7, the first crewed Apollo mission, after the fire that killed 3 astronauts in Apollo 1, Wally Schirra and his crewmates caught head colds. Up there, in zero gravity, mucus didn't drain the same way. Their heads felt heavy, sinuses clogged, ears blocked. They were miserable. On Earth, a cold is an annoyance. In space, it was agony. Yet they had to continue their tasks, snapping at mission control, doing their jobs while feeling utterly drained. It's one of those rare reminders that astronauts weren't superheroes. They were men whose bodies rebelled in space just like ours do on Earth. And then there were the fears they often kept quiet. Astronauts admitted later that they didn't always share their medical symptoms with NASA. Why? Because they feared being grounded. If someone complained of chest pain or dizziness, they risked losing their chance to fly again. So many simply stayed silent, hiding their struggles. Behind the flawless smiles and press conferences were men who sometimes carried hidden ailments, keeping them secret in order to hold on to their dreams. There's even a little-known story from Apollo 17. Gene Cernan, the last man to walk on the moon, described looking back at Earth and suddenly feeling an overwhelming wave of sadness. He knew, in that instant, that no matter what humanity achieved, no moment would ever surpass standing there on that silent grey world, looking back at the blue planet he called home. He said it was like watching the most beautiful sunset you'd ever see, only knowing that it was the last one. All of these stories, the loneliness, the spiritual awakenings, the hidden illnesses, the family photos, the private paintings, remind us of something easy to forget. Apollo wasn't just about technology. It was about fragile, emotional, imperfect human beings venturing into a place utterly alien to them. And when we hear these rare stories, we see Apollo not as a cold chapter in history, but as something far more intimate. It was humanity in all its vulnerability, reaching for the stars and finding both triumph and heartache along the way. Not every Apollo story is about heroism, success, or even personal struggle. Some of the rarest tales are the strange ones, the ones that slip into mystery. Tales of lights, whispers, and unexplainable moments that don't always appear in official reports. Take Apollo 11, the first lunar landing. Everyone knows the famous words. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But fewer people know what Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin discussed privately on a separate radio channel. It was later revealed that during their time on the moon, they switched to what was called a medical channel, a channel rarely monitored by the public. Some believe they were reporting seeing mysterious lights along the edge of a crater, strange glowing shapes that didn't match any reflection or star pattern. NASA has never confirmed this in detail, but for decades, whispers have suggested Armstrong saw something on the moon that unsettled him. Then there was Apollo 12. After landing, astronauts Pete Conrad and Alan Bean reported strange flashes in their vision, even with their eyes closed. At first, NASA thought it was fatigue or imagination. But later, missions confirmed it wasn't. Apollo astronauts began experiencing sudden bursts of light flashes that streaked across their vision in total darkness. Today we know these are caused by cosmic rays hitting the retina. But imagine being in deep space, closing your eyes to rest, and still seeing bright, ghostly streaks of light flickering inside your head. For many, it was unnerving, like the stars were somehow invading their mind. On Apollo 15, David Scott and his crew reported hearing strange knocking sounds from within the spacecraft. They checked the instruments. They checked the hull. Nothing explained it. The sounds eventually stopped, but Scott later admitted they were deeply unsettling. Some believed it was just metal contracting and expanding with temperature changes. But in the silence of space, where every sound is a clue, those knocks felt almost alive. Apollo 16 gave us another curious story. While orbiting the moon, astronauts captured photographs of a bright object in the distance, small, shining, and hovering just above the horizon. NASA dismissed it as lens flare. Yet, the astronauts themselves weren't so sure. John Young, the commander, said later that he didn't like talking about it because he couldn't explain it. The object appeared too solid, too deliberate. In the grainy photos, it looks like a star out of place, but stars don't hover just above the lunar horizon. Then there's the story of Apollo 10, the mission that orbited the moon before Apollo 11. While passing over the far side, out of contact with Earth, the crew reported hearing something strange in their headsets, what they described as outer space music. A high-pitched, eerie whistling sound that seemed to drift and echo in the emptiness. The astronauts were unsettled, whispering to each other whether or not they should even report it. Decades later, the recordings were declassified. NASA eventually suggested it was radio interference between the lunar module and the command module. But still the thought of astronauts floating in silence, hearing ghostly music on the far side of the moon is haunting. And perhaps one of the most chilling stories comes from Apollo 17, the last mission to the moon. Gene Cernan, while walking across the lunar surface, said he heard what sounded like voices, faint, distant, almost like whispers carried on the radio static. He admitted he was exhausted, that maybe his mind was playing tricks. But he also said something about the moon felt strangely inhabited, though he quickly laughed it off in later interviews. Still, even hardened astronauts confessed there was something about the lunar silence that made them feel like they weren't entirely alone. There are even rumors, though never confirmed, of astronauts being instructed not to report certain sightings over the open channel. Some stories claim UFOs were spotted near the moon, hovering, watching. Most of these tales are woven with speculation, fragments from declassified tapes, and decades of whispers. But they continue to spark curiosity because of one simple fact. The Apollo astronauts saw things that the rest of us can never fully understand. Even if we strip away the rumors, the documented facts are strange enough. Cosmic rays painting light across closed eyelids, unknown sounds echoing in spacecraft walls, mysterious objects caught in photographs, unsettling music heard on the far side of the moon. These moments remind us that space isn't just a realm of science, it's a place of mystery. And for the astronauts, it was not always about bravery or discovery. Sometimes it was about facing the eerie unknown, being thousands of miles from Earth, surrounded by silence so deep it almost seemed to breathe, with only the thinnest shell of metal between themselves and the void. In that kind of environment, even the smallest unexplained detail could feel monumental. And maybe that's why these stories stay with us, because they leave open a question. What really happened out there? What did the Apollo astronauts truly see, hear, and feel in the dark silence of space? While the mysteries of the Apollo missions are haunting in their own way, there's another side of these stories that doesn't get enough attention. The close calls, the near disasters, the moments when history could have gone a very different way, but didn't. We all know about Apollo 13. Houston, we've had a problem. It's the most famous survival story in space. But what most people don't know is that other Apollo missions came terrifyingly close to disaster too, in ways that never made the headlines. Apollo 12, for example, was struck by lightning, not once, but twice, only seconds after launch. The rocket was still clawing its way into the sky when both strikes slammed into it, instantly shutting down fuel cells and confusing the entire guidance system. For a terrifying moment, the rocket looked doomed. But a quick call from a flight controller, just 3 words, switch SCE to AUX, saved the mission. If that controller hadn't remembered a small technical procedure buried in training, Apollo 12 might have exploded on live television. Then there was Apollo 14. Most people remember it because Alan Shepard played golf on the moon. But before that light-hearted moment, the mission almost didn't happen at all. Their docking mechanism jammed, refusing to connect the command module with the lunar module. Without a proper dock, they wouldn't have been able to land or return. For hours, the astronauts fought with the system, running check after check, while mission control scrambled for answers. Finally, through a combination of persistence and sheer luck, the connection held. Apollo 14 made it to the surface, but for a while, they were just one failed latch away from catastrophe. And Apollo 16, another forgotten scare, During preparations to descend to the lunar surface, a critical guidance system began sending strange signals. For hours, the landing was in question. Imagine training for years, traveling hundreds of thousands of miles, and then being told you might not be able to land at all. The crew waited, hearts pounding, until engineers on Earth finally resolved the issue. The descent was cleared. But that shadow of doubt stayed with them. Even the final mission, Apollo 17, wasn't immune. Just before liftoff from the moon's surface, Gene Cernan accidentally damaged a fender on the lunar rover. At first, it seemed like a small mishap, but without the fender, the rover kicked up dangerous amounts of moon dust. Dust that could clog suits, damage instruments, and even threaten their ability to return safely. The astronauts had to improvise, fashioning a makeshift repair out of maps and duct tape. It worked, but barely. A simple piece of bent metal nearly jeopardized the last Apollo walk on the moon. Each of these moments reminds us how fragile the missions really were. The Apollo program was built on courage, but also on razor-thin margins. A single failed circuit, a loose bolt, or a bad calculation could have ended everything. Yet somehow, against the odds, they succeeded again and again. And maybe that's why these rare Apollo stories matter so much, because they show us the human side of the greatest space adventure in history. Not just the triumphs, not just the iconic words, but the whispers, the close calls, the private fears, and the mysteries we may never fully understand. So the next time you see those black and white photos of astronauts on the moon, remember behind each smile and each confident step was a story we were never fully told. Some were haunting, some were heroic, some were nearly disastrous. But together, they paint a richer, deeper picture of what it really meant to explore beyond Earth. And maybe, late at night, as you lie back and close your eyes, you hear it too, the faint whistling of that space music, the knocks on the spacecraft walls, or the whispers of dust beneath alien boots. The Apollo missions weren't just history. They were mystery. And those mysteries are still drifting out there, waiting. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending your time here tonight. If you want to keep exploring the unknown, there's another story waiting for you right on your screen. Click it, and I'll see you there. And don't forget subscribe so you'll never miss the next mystery.